The Impossible Library. Nobody in Foxglove Heights knew exactly when the library opened. It seemed to have simply appeared one Tuesday morning between the deli and the bicycle repair shop, a narrow brick building the color of aged clay, with stained glass windows that cast fractured jewels of light across the sidewalk, and a mahogany door that made the sound of bells even when its brass chimes hung motionless. The sign above the entrance read, "The Impossible Library," in hand-painted gold letters that caught the morning sun. Beneath this, in smaller script of deep burgundy, "For children who ask difficult questions." Harriet Moon asked more difficult questions before breakfast than most people asked all day. Her teachers called her challenging. Her parents called her spirited. Her older brother called her annoying, though sometimes with a hint of admiration. Why is the sky blue, scientifically speaking? At age 5, how do we know dinosaurs didn't have feathers if we only found their bones? At age 6, if everyone sees colors differently, how do we know we're all talking about the same blue? At age 7. Now 8, Harriet's latest question had brought an uncomfortable silence to the dinner table. Why don't you and Dad like each other anymore? Her parents had exchanged that special grown-up look, the one that said, "They're too young to understand," and changed the subject to homework. But Harriet had seen the stacks of paperwork labeled "Dissolution of Marriage" hidden in her mother's desk drawer. She'd noticed how her father slept in the guest room. She'd counted the days since she'd heard them laugh together, 73. The morning after the dinner table question, Harriet noticed the impossible library for the first time while walking to school. The deep red bricks caught the morning light in a way that made the building seem warmer than its neighbors. She was certain it hadn't been there the day before, and Harriet noticed everything. A sign in the window caught her eye. "Yes, we have books about that." She hesitated. She couldn't be late for Miss Patterson's mathematics quiz. But something about the library tugged at her, like a forgotten word on the tip of her tongue. Harriet checked her watch. A real one with hands, not a digital one like the other kids had. The brass case gleamed against her wrist, its face the color of tea-stained paper. 20 minutes until school. If she hurried, she could take a quick peek. The door swung open before she touched it. The bell chimes tinkled merrily despite their stillness. Inside, the impossible library defied architectural logic. The narrow storefront expanded into a vast chamber with ceilings that disappeared into shadowy heights. Bookshelves of rich cherry wood curved in physically improbable ways, forming spirals and loops that shouldn't have been able to support themselves. Brass-wheeled ladders slid along tracks that occasionally crossed thin air. "Hello?" Harriet called, her voice sounding smaller than intended in the vast space. "Good morning, Harriet Moon," replied a voice from somewhere above. Harriet looked up. A woman descended one of the floating ladders, carrying a stack of books bound in leathers of deep blues, rich browns, and wine reds. She had silver-streaked black hair arranged in a tidy bun, spectacles that caught and split the light into brief rainbows, and a cardigan the color of blackberries, with pockets that seemed to contain more items than could possibly fit. "How do you know my name?" Harriet asked. "The Impossible Library keeps excellent records," the woman replied, reaching the floor and setting down her stack of books on a desk of polished maple. "I'm Miss Bartleby, the librarian. What question brings you here today?" Harriet blinked. "I didn't say I had a question." "No one enters the Impossible Library without a question," Miss Bartleby said matter-of-factly. "It's quite literally impossible." Harriet considered this. "Why don't my parents like each other anymore?" she finally asked. Miss Bartleby nodded as if this were a perfectly ordinary reference inquiry. "Ah, family dynamics. Third spiral, northwest quadrant." She consulted a peculiar compass that had at least 8 directions, its needle gleaming like polished silver. "Follow me." The librarian led Harriet through a maze of bookcases, Some shelves contained ordinary-looking books bound in leather and cloth. Others held objects that weren't books at all. Globes that showed unfamiliar continents, mechanical devices with constantly moving brass and copper parts, jars containing what appeared to be captured weather, miniature storm clouds, swirls of mist, and what looked like bottled sunlight. They stopped at a circular reading area where several armchairs upholstered in deep blue velvet surrounded a table shaped like a perfectly rendered question mark, its surface polished to a mirror shine. "Sit," Miss Bartleby instructed, disappearing behind a nearby shelf. When she returned, she carried a book bound in leather the deep blue of the night sky. No title marked its cover or spine. "This isn't a book about why my parents don't like each other," Harriet said doubtfully. "No," Miss Bartleby agreed. "It's a book about why you think they don't like each other. There's an important difference." She placed the volume on the table. "The Impossible Library doesn't provide simple answers to difficult questions, Harriet. It provides impossible books that help readers discover answers for themselves." "What makes this book impossible?" Harriet asked, always practical. "Open it and see." Harriet tentatively lifted the cover. Inside was an illustration, not a drawing or a photograph, but something in between, of her own kitchen. Her parents stood frozen in what appeared to be an argument, their faces tight with anger. The image was so detailed she could see the vein pulsing in her father's temple. "Turn the page," Miss Bartleby suggested. The next page showed the same scene, but now Harriet could see speech bubbles above her parents. Her father's read, "I'm terrified of failing you and the children." Her mother's, "I feel like you've stopped seeing me years ago." "That's not what they were really saying," Harriet objected. "They were arguing about Dad working late again." "Ah," Miss Bartleby nodded. "Turn the page once more." The third illustration showed her parents from a different angle. Now Harriet could see what they couldn't see in the moment, each other's expressions when the other wasn't looking. Longing, sadness, fear. "This is wrong," Harriet insisted, closing the book with a snap. "They don't look at each other like that. They barely look at each other at all." "The Impossible Library doesn't deal in fiction," Miss Bartleby said gently, "though perspective can sometimes be stranger than fiction." The clock on the wall, which had 13 hours instead of 12, chimed a warning. "Oh no, I'm going to be late for my math quiz." Harriet jumped up. "Time moves differently in the Impossible Library," Miss Bartleby said. "You'll find you have exactly enough of it." She handed Harriet a library card that seemed to glow with a soft internal light, like captured moonbeams. "You may borrow the book for 3 days. After that, it must be returned, or it will return itself, which can be rather dramatic." Harriet hesitated, then placed the book in her backpack. "Thank you. I think." "Every question has at least 2 answers," Miss Bartleby called after her as Harriet hurried toward the exit. "The one we want to hear and the one we need to understand." For 3 days, Harriet studied the impossible book. Each time she opened it, she discovered new pages showing her parents in moments she had never witnessed. Her father sitting alone in his car before coming home, practicing a smile. Her mother looking at old photographs late at night with tears in her eyes. Most strangely, the book showed moments from years before Harriet was born. Her parents laughing on their first date, planning their wedding, painting the nursery before her brother was born in a cheerful yellow. They looked at each other differently then, with a kind of brightness that had slowly dimmed. On the third day, Harriet found her parents sitting stiffly in the living room, reviewing documents in silence. The impossible book weighed heavily in her backpack. "I need to ask you something," she announced. Her parents looked up, startled by her serious tone. "Do you remember how you used to look at each other?" Harriet asked. Her father frowned. "What do you mean, Harry?" Harriet pulled out the impossible book. "I want to show you something." As she opened it, a strange thing happened. The pages began to glow softly, casting a warm golden light onto her parents' faces. They leaned forward despite themselves. "Where did you get this?" her mother whispered, touching a page that showed her younger self gazing adoringly at Harriet's father as he played guitar in their first apartment. "The Impossible Library," Harriet answered honestly. "It's for children who ask difficult questions." Her father turned a page and saw himself through her mother's eyes, not the tired, frustrated man he'd become, but the person she had fallen in love with, still visible beneath the weight of years. "I didn't know you still remembered this," he said softly to her mother. "I didn't know you still thought about that," her mother replied, pointing to another page. Harriet watched as they continued turning pages, their expressions softening, occasionally laughing or wiping away tears. The stiffness between them didn't disappear completely, but something shifted, like ice beginning a slow thaw. Hours later, after her parents had talked more honestly than they had in months, Harriet slipped out to return the book. The Impossible Library glowed with warm light against the evening sky, its stained glass windows capturing the sunset in fragments of ruby, amber, and sapphire. Miss Bartleby waited at the front desk, as if she'd known exactly when Harriet would arrive. "Did you find your answer?" she asked as Harriet handed back the book. "Not exactly," Harriet admitted, "but I think my parents might have found a question they forgot to ask each other." "Which was?" "Do you remember why we fell in love?" Miss Bartleby smiled. "An excellent question, often more useful than any answer." Harriet ran her finger along the edge of her Moonlight Library card. "The book didn't fix everything. They still have a lot to figure out." "Impossible books rarely fix things completely," Miss Bartleby agreed. "They simply make the impossible possible again, seeing what time and hurt have hidden." "Do you have a book that could help them remember how to like each other?" Harriet asked. Miss Bartleby adjusted her spectacles, which briefly caught the light. "Perhaps. But that might be a question they need to ask for themselves." She studied Harriet thoughtfully. "You know, the Impossible Library is always looking for assistant librarians, children who understand that difficult questions rarely have simple answers. Would I get to read all the impossible books?" Harriet asked, eyes widening. "Eventually, though I should warn you, some answers you find might not be the ones you were hoping for." Harriet thought about her parents, how they had looked at the images of their younger selves with surprise and recognition, how they had started talking, really talking, for the first time in 73 days. "I think," Harriet said carefully, "that true answers are rarely what we expect them to be. That's what makes them true." Miss Bartleby's smile deepened. "Come back next Tuesday after school. We'll start with the geography section. Maps of places that exist only in promises kept and broken." As Harriet left the Impossible Library, she noticed her Moonlight Library card had changed. It now read, "Harriet Moon, Apprentice Librarian, Department of Difficult Questions." Her parents still had much to figure out. The paperwork labeled "Dissolution of Marriage" hadn't disappeared. But Harriet understood something now that she hadn't before. Love wasn't simply present or absent, like a light switched on or off. It was more like a language people could forget how to speak, but might, with patience and courage, remember again. That night, for the first time in 73 days, her parents sat together at the kitchen table long after dinner was over, talking quietly. They didn't notice Harriet watching from the hallway, or how she carefully recorded this moment in a small notebook labeled "Impossible Possibilities." Some questions don't need answers right away. Sometimes, asking them differently is enough to change everything. The end. Thank you for listening to The Impossible Library, a published work of Millennia Publishing. Visit millenniapublishing.com to discover more. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible stories. Hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads.